Panel dealing with seeking refuge in Europe, law and transition. The panel will focus on law, policy and transition period in the refugee experience, legal challenges and solutions, the limitations of the enforcement to international refugee law and how that impacts the refugee experience. We have three speakers. The first one is Dr. Freigang. Dr. Freigang is the first secretary and political officer at the EU delegation to the State of Israel. He is a German career diplomat, currently in the services of the European External Action Service. He served as desk officer for Israel and Middle East peace process at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, a political officer at the German Embassy in Buenos Aires, and other officer, and he holds degree from the law faculty, the University of Humboldt in Berlin, and also master degrees from LSE in London and in Paris. Dr. Freigang will give an overview of the EU policy, the EU agenda on migration, the different elements of the comprehensive approach, and the linkage with EU policy with regard to addressing the roots causes of migration. Please.
You have a border, you want to keep it, therefore there are people smuggling in, and they come in and they all say we want asylum, and then you have to choose, right? Who should receive protection, who should not receive protection? So this is the fundamental question that the law tries to answer. The law imposes obligations, it imposes restrictions, but it also legitimates different modes of intervention by government. Well, the law does both. It does not only impose restrictions, but it also allows government intervention in various ways. And this is what I will be sketching in the next few minutes. And maybe just last preliminary comment, you spoke about Europe since 1945. It's important to say that in Germany, in the process of the Europeanization, especially from the middle 1980s, there are waves of refugee crisis in similar sizes. So the last year that was before 2014 that Europe had the same number of asylum seekers was in 1990. With the fall of the Eastern Bloc, and before that, and just a bit afterwards with the disintegration of Yugoslavia. So it's a foretold crisis also in the context of European integration, and in the same moment of free movement within Europe, you have to fortify the borders outside Europe, and this is in this respect, and Europe is building towards this moment for over 20 years. The global approach to migration and mobility is a globalized European approach that has been pushed forward for over 15 years. So Europe is thinking of this for quite some time, handling it better in Africa and not so good in the Middle Eastern context. And this is why we're seeing this present outflow in my view. It's just for a few figures. This is produced by Frontex, the European Border Agency, and I think what's important, what I want to point is not only the routes, but also I think it's clear that it's a map of an invasion, right? It's an invasion from three directions, and it's not only Syrians and it's not only Africans. It comes also from as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan on your right-hand side. Now, these are the routes, and so the problem for Europe is how to make sure that we only give status to Syrians, and we cannot give status to Iraqis and Afghans and Pakistani, and also all the other people that join in the route from the Balkans, for instance. So this is the European question that the law has to answer. And as the numbers climb, and they climb from April-May 2015, it's not only Syrians coming in, but also Balkans coming in. And I'll move there in a moment. if you see, these are the latest figures that I've seen from the second quarter of 2015. So Syria is a good quarter, but it's not the only one. Right? Just you can look at the figures at the background. You have Afghans, you have Somalis, you have Albanians, you have Kosovarians. Everyone is coming in, and so that, again, this is the context of. We are speaking of European intervention today, but I think it's also important to remember in the background what the sort of NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, the establishment of the Kosovarian protectorate. That's also part of what I think the response that we're seeing today. So and so the second year, so one problem is many people are coming in from different countries, and we have to make sure that we only give status to those that we really need to give by international law, and avoid and reject all the rest. The second is how to make sure that in a European context there is an alignment between the 28 European countries. So migrants or refugees will not forum shop and take the best route for where there are good migrant networks and good jobs. And as you've seen in the...
Could you actually say something about the colors, because we cannot...
All right, so I'll say something about the colors. I'll say just maybe again, what's important to see here is that migrants are moving into Germany, and now they're moving, and Germany and Sweden, and here I'm moving forward in a moment. Again, these are Frontex, and these are Eurostat. These are the most recent Eurostat. This is for the whole of 2014. In a moment, I'll show a few the latest data for the third quarter of 2015.
But what?
Yeah. So just in a moment, just this is an introduction. So this.
We can't see the caption.
All right. So the sort of pinky is rejected. The yellow are people that is the number the share of people that receive refugee status, that is convention status. The blue is people that receive alternative protection, that is they're not removed. They receive international protection. There are various sorts of international protection that I cannot go into details here. And then there's humanitarian protection. Again, what we see everywhere is as countries close their borders, and refugeehood is the only way to force a state to let you in. So everyone clusters around the refugee definition, and then the refugee definition becomes the high water mark, and states create inferior categories that their aim is to be more temporary. When the Yugoslavians fled, most of them received temporary protection, group protection, and not refugee status, and then they were removed back to Yugoslavia as the crisis in the Balkans ended. And you hear when we know that refugees, we need to integrate them, because it is clear that they will not return quickly, and this is why many European states have devised inferior categories of legal protection that abide by the non-refoulement rule of I will not return you to where you will be persecuted or to where you will be at risk, but it does not give full rights, and I will not go into the details here. And what's important to see in this slide is that in different countries you have better or worse chance of receiving refugee status or more secured status, and this is why we see clustering in different countries and less in others. Right? You see the numbers for France and Greece and Belgium here as the rejections. So this is rejections. So and the situation in Sweden and Germany is better. And here you can see the numbers for Germany and Sweden in the last Germany and Sweden. Here all the other Western European countries are at your right hand side. You can see the difference, and you see why migrants and asylum seekers cluster around some countries. So that is one. The second is that it's not only about Syrians, but Syrians have a better chance of receiving either refugee status or complementary protection that's why, this is another reason why if you go on the land route from Iraq or Afghanistan through Turkey, you would want you would want to pass as Syrian, right? Like Ethiopians wanted to pass as Eritreans in Israel. So you want to pass as a citizen of a country that will receive group protection. So this is a governmental and administrative problem, but also the legal problem that the EU has to face, and it tries to face it in a way that it says, I go by my obligations to the international refugee regime, but I also try to maintain clear line within or across my member states, so there won't be such differentiations. And in this context, the main legal instrument is the European Community Law. So the European Community Law and the push for a common asylum system, which is what Europe is doing and is trying to do, again, for over 15 years. I think now it is becoming clear for many European countries that it has that a common asylum system is necessary for not to reintroducing border checks and disentangling the free movement of the Schengen regime. So part of the state of the play, as you've heard here, is scale up infringement procedures. That is, when countries do not go by the procedures of Dublin regulations, that means that you have to file an asylum claim at your first country of refuge, right? So, which overburdens the country, the ports of entry. If you have to file an asylum claim in your first country of refuge, so everyone will have to file their asylum claims in Italy if they come by sea, or in Greece if they come by foot. But the situation in Greece is not as good as it is in other places, also in terms of detention centers and in terms of rate of asylum requests. So this is part of the state of the play: how to rejuggle the burden and perhaps also shift part of the burden to countries that are more far away in the route of migration. Just to map, how much time do I have left? 5 minutes, all right. So I will not address the foreign policy issues. I'll just say that a lot of the monetary reallocation goes, actually the majority, as from what I read, goes to third countries. That is protection elsewhere. Let's make sure that Africans don't remain in Africa, and that Syrians remain close by. And this is the context of the EU-Turkey agreement. Give over 3 billion euros to Turkey. Reopen the negotiations on visas to Turkish citizens, and then also say that Turkey is a country of safe country of asylum, and this is like Albania, Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey. Right. So the idea is, let's declare that all the countries en route are safe countries of origin that we can return people to. So this is the main, and this is allowed by international refugee law, like deporting criminals in the context of what happened in Köln. It is allowed not to give refugee status to someone that was convicted for a serious criminal offense. So the law legitimates this sort of trying to shift the burden back to the states of transit and state of origin, and Europe is engaging in this practice extensively. What it also does, however, is that It tries to reinforce its common asylum system in introducing hotspots that you did not refer to, that is centers for, again, the idea is to create centers close to the countries of origin where migrants, asylum seekers will be screened. If you don't have status, we'll push you back quickly. If you do have status and we realize that the Syrian conflict will not end soon, so we will move you further in and then allow you routes for integration. And many of the Syrians moving now are Alawites, and not only Sunni or Shiites that were previously persecuted, because it is clear for many immigrants that this is a moment where you can leave, and when the routes are open, so it's not only Syrians that go through the gates. So this is part of what we're seeing. So of course I covered only a few of the points that I wanted to put forward. So I think if to summarize, I think that the European response is in the context of European community law to make sure that on the one hand countries abide by the European directives that are European law, and that there are common European standards of who to let in and who not to let in. So that is one. To allow countries to withdraw temporarily, as you heard, from the no checks Schengen zone, allow prolongation of temporary border controls. So this is something that the European community law can allow without totally restructuring the idea of the free movement zone in Europe. And again, abiding by the international refugee law, hoping that most of the people can be given protection elsewhere. I'll stop here. Maybe just a last comment, which is, I think, two things, very, very quickly. One is there is a European human rights regime. It is much less influential. It was influential for a moment when it struck down the readmission agreement between Libya and Italy, but it is not a strong force in underpinning the European immigration policy. And the second is state law. And part of the state law, so asylum is directed by state law, and we've seen the divergence. And the second is, and I think this is something that we will see in the future, is furthering the tendencies and inclinations that we have seen in Europe for over a decade, and that is the reintroduction of more stringent citizenship tests, nationality tests, attempts to make sure that if someone is integrated, he will go follow the constitutional values of the states of where a person is sitting rules. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mrs. Alisa Norit McBride. She's a PhD researcher at the Minerva Center for Law under Extreme Conditions. She received BA degree from the University of South Florida and a master's degree from the University of Ben Gurion. She is also the chairman of the board of directors for the African Refugee Development Center in Israel. She will bring to us the refugee perspectives.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me okay? So in the hopes of not losing everyone's attention just before lunch, I wanted to work as sort of a bridge between what we've been talking about already, which has actually been a great base in EU policy and in law, and to work in how the law is perceived and how it affects refugees who are in flight. My area of research is specifically looking at refugees that are sort of stuck in the permanent state of flight for decades at a time. And the Syrian case is especially interesting because it's a relatively new case. It's blown up enormously, very, very quickly. And in a world where we have an enormous corpus of refugee academic research, we have all these policies, all these laws, international institutions, regional institutions, national laws, we should have a better system in place to handle these types of emergencies. And yet, as we've all can kind of agree, we don't, and that there's breakdowns in the system. So what I'm looking at is host state shifting. And in the past, host state shifting was something that you only saw within a region. In the refugee protracted situations you have in sub-Saharan Africa, refugees were constantly shifting around to different hosting states in an attempt to find the best circumstances for their temporary asylum. We see it in Southeast Asia as well. What's unique about the Syrian case is now we're seeing this shifting around by the refugees outside of their geographical region and outside of their political sphere, so to speak. So in the interest of brevity, I'm not going to get into the confusion of the terms. Just let's say that the terms in refugee flight are often very confusing, even to government officials, and to what the exact extent of what a refugee means, what resettlement means. When we talk about a host state shifting, we're talking about a migrational system that the refugees are instigating themselves. They've already crossed an international border. They've, in most cases, already received refugee status in a country that's circling the country of origin. They've made the decision that their life is not supportable in that original country, and they're going to move out further away from those states which are heavily impacted by the refugee experience in the hopes of finding a better circumstance. So we have a tendency, especially in academia, to sort of point at these states and say, well, you're not following the laws, you're not following the rules, most of whom, as you'll see, are not signatories of the UN Convention on Refugees that we're talking about, or they have limited involvement. But yet there is still this interwoven system of law that should be protecting them from certain interactions. So we've talked a lot about numbers, but just to go over a few that I think are important, and some of the data that's coming out of the Syrian Regional Refugee Resilience Committee, which is a tongue twister, that was just released several weeks ago. They did extensive data on the movement of the Syrians, especially moving up into Europe. And the thing I want to bring to your attention is 73% of the Syrian refugees who have applied for asylum in Europe have already been in, either housed or moved through, the first round of defense as far as refugee hosting states. That would be Lebanon, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and also Egypt and North Africa, which often isn't included in the discussion. A lot of the support in these regions for refugees, which are usually in an in-camp situation, is really pushed onto the UNHCR to do the majority of the heavy lifting as far as warm weather preparation, housing vouchers, food assistance, medical assistance. There's limited capacity for the states to handle these issues. And as you can see here, in 2015, the UNHCR's funds necessary to do all of the services that they routinely do for refugees, specifically the Syrians, was a little over $4 billion. They only made about $2.5 billion, so they're about $2 billion short. And that's just a loss. That just means that people don't get heaters, people don't get blankets. We had the first snowfall on the 6th, and that's a very major issue to refugees who are living in Jordan, who are living in Syria, where children are freezing to death. So if your kids are freezing to death and they can't get an education and you can't find housing, and you could rent an apartment but now you can't because of discriminatory practices, that's not going to be a solution for you even in the short term. You're going to find new solutions elsewhere. And the interesting thing for me, because I deal mostly with refugees who have been in that circumstance for 25, 30 years, very long protracted cases, is the level of interaction and of self-assertion that the Syrians have. When I was in the camp in Jordan in 2013, what surprised me were people who are on WhatsApp, who are coordinating their movement to Europe on WhatsApp. That is not happening among the Somalis. The Karenni in Thailand don't have WhatsApp. They're not contacting each other. They're not so even though we're dealing with a population that is in a huge economic situation, They're far wealthier and more connected than what we see as a whole refugee population around the world. Just to go in, and I wish I had more time to talk about these things in more depth, in the plan that was set up by the 3RP, there was 10 areas in the surrounding refugee hosting countries that were seen as being a problem. This is everything from religious persecution, freedom of movement, freedom of access, health care, just about every possible condition you could have to having a stable refugee circumstance. I'm just going to briefly talk about 3 because I think they highlight the points that I'm speaking of and why Europe and why Germany becomes such a desirable option when these are the circumstances you're living in that first ring of hosting states. So in this particular case, we're looking at employment and we're looking at Jordan. And while we have an enormous amount of both international and regional legislation in regards to how a refugee, an asylum seeker, and in unusual circumstance someone should be handled, as in the regard of having employment. And we have national laws that offer protection as well. We see that about 21% of the refugees in Jordan who want to work are the ones that can work. 64% say that they can't get the work permit necessary because they simply can't afford it, and another 15% can't get through the process. Part of the reason why this is that the standard work permit, which should be 75 dinars, has a surcharge slapped on for refugees of 725 dinars. So you're looking about 4,500 shekels in order to get a work permit. That's simply not a possibility. So while everything is on the up and up in the law, everything is clearly laid out that yes, we're going to offer, these things are going to be in place, they're going to have the ability to do this. There's limitations that are built in that are keeping these people from accessing employment on a regular basis. This leads to most refugees who choose to work to not be able to work in a legal fashion, which puts them at risk of wage problems and hazardous conditions, which presents a problem. They don't have legal recourse because simply they're not working there legally. So they can't go to the police and say, my wages were withheld or my passport was taken. In looking at education, and in this case Lebanon, once again we have both national laws and international laws and several different treaties in place that would give refugees of Syrian origin access to education. Now we talked a little bit earlier about the limitations of education and the stress on the infrastructure, and that's very, very real. And it's very difficult to process 500,000 school-aged refugees, which is about what's in Syria, in Lebanon at the moment. Part of the problem, even though we have agreements by the Ministry of Education as early as 2012 that says that enrollment will happen for everyone, regardless of your status, where you can enroll as a Syrian child may be extremely far from the camp. It may be very far from your home. There's arbitrary enrollment dates, which means you might miss an entire year of school before you can go back into school again. There are municipalities and principals that are just simply saying no, and there hasn't been any legal recourse, there hasn't been any censure for them for not obeying the law, because there's very little political will to stand up for the rights of Syrian refugees. And when you're talking about a limited and stressed system that can only accept so much, and they're dealing with so much already, it becomes very hard to promote this cause. There's been a little bit of an advance with several UN agencies funding about $94 million towards the education system in Lebanon to help serve Syrian refugees, which seems like it's a win, but of our 500,000 Syrian refugees, only 200,000 would this apply to. Another 166,000 Lebanese children will also benefit from it. So while we are very happy to have funds for Lebanese children to have better access to education, if the purpose of these funds is specifically to addressing the needs of Syrian refugees. It's falling short of that by 300,000 individuals. Another particular problem is, it's just a simple thing of getting your grades verified. It's very hard for a Syrian refugee to go on into high school or to go on into the college level because they have to go to the Syrian embassy and get their grades verified, which no one is going to do. They're afraid of repercussions in the country, and they're also afraid of repercussions for their families outside of the country. So it's just simply not going to happen. So once again, we have all of the laws in place, but without the political will and without the infrastructure and the support, both in country, in the region, and nationally and globally, it's very hard for these laws to be enacted in places where refugees are a serious impact. And just finally with housing, I want to look at Egypt because it tends to be the unsung part of the Syrian refugee circumstance. The majority of Syrian refugees that are in Egypt, which is much smaller than for instance, Turkey, are a little bit of a wealthier community. They could afford to get the plane ticket to fly to Egypt, which is a little bit more resources at hand. And with the issue of housing, we have, once again, multiple international, regional, and national laws that should be securing housing for anyone, specifically people who are registered refugees. And unlike the other two examples I brought up, Egypt is a signatory of the UN Convention, so we don't have to maneuver through, memorandums of understanding and applying other treaties. It's directly in the treaty. It's Article 21. It's very, very clear. And there's also national laws. And yet, once again, there's just a lack of response for refugees who are the victims of crime, refugees who are getting price gouged, who are having eviction cases brought into the court, being denied the right to buy property even though they have the proper papers in order. Police harassment is a problem, especially in Cairo, and a lack of access to the courts, which are all things that are galvanized within the convention. They just simply are not working in places where refugees are in large populations. So in these areas of friction, even though they do provide language communication, there's a cultural communication that works, there's so many barriers that it is really becoming unsupportable, especially for a population that never saw a refugee experience as being part of their experience into the long term. So just very quickly, and as I said, I briefed over the most briefest of subjects. We could have gone through all 10 in depth, talked about each law, how it's violated, and I really wish I had that opportunity. But to just give you the information, and for anyone who's interested in seeing the raw data from the plan, just get in touch with me and I'm happy to send it to you. But we see that there is a major gulf between what is the legally mandated refugee protection and what's the reality in host states. A lot of that has to do with an over-reliance on the UNHCR to serve as a de facto government for refugees. There's also limited capacity for refugees in these countries. And there's lack of support from the international community to help give the capacity and the structure necessary to cope with these massive influxes of individuals. It's sort of seen as this is a regional problem and this is your region and we don't have to pay attention to this. Or maybe we'll send a little bit of money and that's okay. But what we've seen, partially because of Syria's location, partly because of the world we live in now, and also the mobility of these refugees, is that it's not the circumstance where we can keep them in one geographical place anymore. There are certainly cases to try and to bring them back, but there's major motivations for risk of life and safety in host countries that are hosting large populations, and it's making it intolerable for them to stay there, which is one of the reasons why they're motivated to move into Europe. So, once again, that's just the briefest of overview.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes for discussions, comments, notes, and questions, please.
make a general comment. First of all the papers, everything, I missed last year. And the main crisis, in my opinion,